49. The war on the land had now come to a halt at the Trebia. In the meantime, there had been land and sea operations conducted by the consul Sempronius, and some even before Sempronius's arrival in the area of Sicily and the islands off the Italian coast. 20 quinqueremes, along with 1,000 marines, had been dispatched by the Carthaginians to conduct raids on the coastal areas of Italy. 9 of these headed for the Lipara Islands, 8 for the island of Vulcan. The other 3 were swept into the straits by rough seas. These 3 were sighted off Messana, and 12 ships were sent to intercept them by King Hiero of Syracuse, who happened to be in Messana at the time awaiting the arrival of the Roman consul. The ships captured the Carthaginian vessels, meeting no resistance, and brought them to the harbor of Messana. From the prisoners, it was learned that apart from the fleet of 20 ships sent to Italy, to which the prisoners themselves belonged, a further 35 quinqueremes were making for Sicily, with the aim of spreading disaffection amongst the former Carthaginian allies. The principal mission of these vessels was to seize Lilybaeum, they said, but they thought that this fleet had also been driven off course towards the Agates Islands by the same bad weather by which they had been scattered themselves. The king made a full report of this, just as it had been told to him in a letter to Marcus Aemilius, who had responsibility for Sicily, and he advised Aemilius to secure Lilybaeum with a powerful garrison. Officers and tribunes were immediately sent around the various city-states by the praetor, pressing the inhabitants to heighten their caution, and above all to keep Lilybaeum on a war footing. A proclamation was issued that crews should take to their ships cooked rations sufficient for 10 days, and that they should immediately embark when the signal was given. In addition, men were sent the length of the coast to keep watch from towers for the coming of the enemy fleet. The Carthaginians had purposely slowed the progress of their ships in order to arrive at Lilybaeum before dawn, but thanks to this vigilance on shore they were nevertheless detected, as there was a moon through the night, and they were also coming under sail. A signal was immediately given from the watchtowers. There was a call to arms in the town, and the ships were manned. Some of the troops mounted the walls and patrolled the gates, others boarded the ships. The Carthaginians could see they would not be engaging men caught off guard, and they kept their distance from the harbor until daylight, using the time to stow their tackle and ready the fleet for action. At daybreak, they backed water into the open sea to allow room for the engagement and ensure that the enemy ships had a clear passage from the harbor. The Romans did not refuse battle either. They drew confidence from the memory of their past successes in those very waters and from the numbers and fighting ability of their men. 50. When they got out to sea, the plan of the Romans was to join battle and fight at close quarters. The Carthaginians, by contrast, wanted to maneuver, to use tactics rather than brute force, and to make it a battle of ships rather than of men and weapons. Their fleet was well manned with crews, but short of marines, and many a ship was grappled. The Carthaginians had nothing like the same number of soldiers fighting from it. When this was noticed, the Romans' numerical advantage raised their morale, while the Carthaginians' deficiency lowered theirs. 7 Carthaginian vessels were immediately surrounded, and the rest took flight. There were 1,700 marines and sailors in the captured ships, including 3 Carthaginian noblemen. The Roman fleet returned to port undamaged. Just 1 ship was holed, but even she was brought home. The consul, Tiberius Sempronius, came to Messana after this battle, but before news of it reached those in town, As Sempronius entered the strait, King Hero came to meet him at the head of a fully equipped fleet. Hiero crossed from the royal barge to the Roman flagship, Hiero crossed from the royal barge to the Roman flagship, congratulated the consul on having arrived safely with his army and ships, and prayed that he would have a successful and favorable crossing to Sicily. He then explained the situation on the island, and the schemes of the Carthaginians, and promised to be as committed a helper of the Roman people as an old man as he had been as a youth in the earlier war. He would supply the consul's legions and the crews with grain and clothing, and at no cost, he said, adding that Lilybaeum and the coastal city-states were facing great danger, and some would be happy to see a regime change. The consul, therefore, felt he should lose no time in heading for Lilybaeum with his fleet, and the king and the royal fleet set off with him. During the voyage from Messana, they received news from Lilybaeum of the battle that had been fought there, and of the defeat and capture of the enemy ships. 51. The consul sent Hiero and the royal fleet back from Lilybaeum, and leaving the praetor to protect the Sicilian coastline, himself crossed to the island of Melita, which was occupied by the Carthaginians. On his arrival, Hamilcar's son of Gisgo, who commanded the garrison there, surrendered himself along with slightly fewer than 2,000 men, and the town and the island were turned over to the Romans. A few days later, Sempronius returned to Lilybaeum, and there the prisoners, apart from men of noble birth, were all auctioned off by the consul and praetor. Now that the consul felt that Sicily was well enough protected in that quarter, he crossed to the island of Vulcan, as there had been a report of the Carthaginian fleet at anchor there. However, no enemy was found in the vicinity of the islands. It so happened that the Carthaginians had already crossed to conduct raids on the coastline of Italy, and after laying waste the agricultural land of Vibo, they were even threatening the town of Vibo. News of the enemy raid on the farmland of Vibo reached the consul as he was heading back to Sicily. Sempronius was also brought a letter from the Senate informing him of Hannibal's crossing into Italy and instructing him to bring his colleague help at the earliest possible opportunity. Sempronius now had many simultaneous concerns on his mind. He straightway boarded his army on some ships and sent it up the Adriatic to Ariminum. He assigned to his legate, Sextus Pomponius, the task of patrolling the territory of Vibo and the coastal areas of Italy with 25 warships, and he brought the fleet of the praetor, Marcus Aemilius, up to a full complement of 50 ships. Sempronius himself settled affairs in Sicily, and then came to Ariminum with 10 ships skirting the Italian coast. He marched off from there with his army and joined up with his colleague at the river Tribia. 52. At this point, the two consuls and all available Roman forces were facing Hannibal, and it was perfectly clear that either the Empire of Rome could be defended by those troops, or else there was simply no hope. However, one of the consuls, disheartened by the single cavalry engagement and by the wound he had suffered, preferred to see things deferred. The other, his drive still fresh, and so all the more audacious, would brook no delay. In those days, the land between the Trebia and the Po was inhabited by Gauls, and as the two superpowers came into conflict, these peoples vacillated in their support quite clearly with an eye on gaining the eventual winner's favor. The Romans were happy enough with the situation as long as the Gauls took no action, but the Carthaginian leader was not at all happy. He had come to liberate the Gauls, he would say, and at their request. Hannibal's anger, and at the same time his wish to enrich his men with spoils, led to his order 2,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, Numidians mostly, but with some Gauls among them, to systematically pillage Gallic farmlands right up to the banks of the Po. The Gauls had been ambivalent up to that point, but with no help at hand, they were now driven to turn from the perpetrators of the wrong done to them to those they hoped would avenge it. They sent a deputation to the consuls and begged for Roman aid for the land that was suffering damage because its inhabitants were simply too loyal to Rome. Cornelius liked neither the reason for taking action nor the timing. He was wary of the Gallic people because of their many acts of treachery, and even in the memory of other things had been erased by the passage of time. He remembered the recent duplicity of the Boii. Sempronius, by contrast, was of the opinion that the strongest bond for maintaining the loyalty of the allies was forced by defending the first ones who needed help. While his colleague hesitated, Sempronius sent his cavalry and some 1,000 javelin-throwing infantry across the Trebia to defend the Gallic farmlands. These took the Carthaginians by surprise as they were roving around out of formation, most of them also burdened with loot, and created sheer panic and great carnage, chasing them right to the outpost of the enemy camp. From here, they were driven back by superior enemy numbers, and only with the arrival of reinforcements did they resume their offensive. Fortunes then alternated, the two sides by turns in pursuit and on the defensive, and, although they finished the combat on even terms, enemy casualties were greater, and the Romans were credited with the victory. 53. But in no one's eyes was the victory greater and more decisive than the consul's. Sempronius was absolutely delighted. He had carried the day with the branch of the forces with which other consul had seen defeat. His men's morale had been restored and strengthened. He climbed, and nobody wanted to delay an all-out battle, apart from his colleague. Cornelius's problem was more psychological than physical, he said. The thought of his wound made him shudder at the prospect of armed engagement. But they should not become decrepit in a sick man's company. Why put things off further, or fritter away valuable time? Were they waiting for a third consul, another army? The Carthaginians were encamped in Italy, he said, almost in sight of the city. What they were after was not Sicily and Sardinia, which had been taken from them by conquest, or Spain north of the Ebro. No, what they wanted was to evict the Romans from their native soil, and from the land in which they had been born. Our fathers were used to campaigning around the walls of Carthage, he declared. How they would groan to see their descendants two consuls with consular armies cowering within their fortifications in the heart of Italy, when the Carthaginian has brought under his sway the lands between the Alps and the Apennines. Such were Sempronius's comments at his colleague's sickbed, and in staff meetings as well, as if he were making a public address. He was edged on, too, by the approaching elections. He feared that the war might drag on into the term of the new consuls, and also by the chance of appropriating to himself all the glory while the colleague lay ill. Accordingly, while Cornelius remonstrated in vain, he ordered his men to prepare for an imminent engagement. Hannibal could see what his enemy's best strategy would be, and he could scarcely hope for any impulsive or foolish move on the consul's part. But he now knew for himself what he had heard earlier, namely that one of the consuls was by nature hot-headed and impetuous, and he also believed that Sempronius would have been made even more impetuous by his successful skirmish with the Punic riding party. He was therefore not without hope of soon having an opportunity for action. He now focused anxiously on not missing his point, while his enemy's soldiers lacked experience, while the better of the two generals was out of action with a wound, and while the Gauls were still in good spirits. For he realized that the further their vast horde was drawn from home, the less eager they would be to follow him. For these and other such reasons, he was hoping for an imminent engagement, and he wished to initiate one if the enemy hesitated. Gallic spies were chosen from gathering the intelligence he required, a safer option since Gauls were serving in both camps, and when these brought back news that the Romans were ready for battle, he proceeded to seek out a spot for an ambush. '54. Between the two armies was a stream, high-banked on both sides and overgrown with marsh reeds and the shrubs and prickles usually found covering wastelands. Hannibal rode around the area, and after seeing for himself that it provided sufficient cover for concealing even cavalry, he said to his brother Mago, "This will be the spot to position yourself. Select from your entire force 100 infantrymen and 100 cavalrymen, and come to me with them at first watch. Now it is time for rest and refreshment." With that, the officers were dismissed, and shortly afterwards Mago appeared with his hand-picked soldiers. "I see here the toughest of my men," said Hannibal, "but to have strength in numbers to match the strength of your courage, you must each choose 9 men like yourselves from your respective troops and maniples. Mago will show you the spot for the ambush. You are facing an enemy blind to such military stratagems." So saying, Hannibal sent Mago off with his 1,000 horsemen and 1,000 infantry. At dawn he ordered his Numidian cavalry to cross the river Trebia, ride up to the gates of the enemy, and entice him out to battle by hurling spears at the sentry post. Then, after provoking a confrontation, they were to draw him over the river by gradually ceding ground. Such were the orders of the Numidians. The other infantry and cavalry officers were instructed to tell all their men to take their meal and then await the signal under arms and with horses saddled. When the Numidians struck, Sempronius first led out all his cavalry, supremely confident as he was in that branch of his forces, and then 6,000 infantry, and finally his entire force. He was eager for the battle, and was already decided upon fighting it. It happened to be the winter solstice, and there was snowy weather in the country between the Alps and the Apennines. an area that is also subject to intense cold from the neighboring rivers and marshlands. In addition, men and horses had been hurriedly led out, without taking nourishment or any measures to contradict the cold. They were chilled to the marrow, and with every step they took towards the breezes coming from the river, the more intense became the cold, blowing in their faces. But then, chasing the retreating Numidians, they plunged into the water, which had been swollen by overnight rain, and came up to their chest. At that point, and especially as they emerged from the river, they all felt their limbs go numb with cold, and they could scarcely hold their weapons, and at the same time exhaustion, and, as the day progressed, hunger also sapped their strength.